I was 9 years old the night my father disappeared. I remember it vividly because it was the first time in my life I ever truly felt alone. Up until that point, life had been normal, I guess. My mother, father, and I lived in a modest house at the edge of a small town where everyone knew everyone. My dad worked at a mechanic shop, and my mom taught at the elementary school I attended. Life was predictable, stable, until the night everything changed. That night started like any other. My dad came home late from work, his hands covered in grease and dirt, but with the same tired smile he always wore. He gave me a rough pat on the head, muttering something about how I should be getting ready for bed. My mom was already asleep on the couch, a book resting open on her chest. It was a typical night in our quiet little house. But something was off. I noticed it when Dad sat at the kitchen table, lighting a cigarette. He wasn't supposed to smoke in the house. Mom hated it, said it stunk up the place. But he didn't seem to care that night. He just sat there, staring into the dim glow of the kitchen light, the smoke curling lazily around his head like a ghost. I crept closer, my bare feet making soft thuds against the floor. "Dad," I whispered, my voice barely audible over the hum of the fridge. "Are you okay?" He didn't answer at first, just sat there, taking slow drags from the cigarette, his eyes distant and dark. Then, after what felt like an eternity, he looked at me. His eyes, I'll never forget the look in his eyes. They were hollow, like something inside him had broken, like the man I called my father was barely holding himself together. "I have to go," he said, his voice low and gruff. It didn't sound like him. It didn't sound like my father. I furrowed my brows, confused. "Go where?" He didn't answer me. Instead, he stood up abruptly, the chair scraping against the floor with a screech. He stubbed out the cigarette, grabbed his coat from the back of the chair, and headed for the door. I stood there, frozen, my heart pounding in my chest. "Dad," I called after him, my voice trembling now. "Where are you going?" He paused at the door, one hand on the knob, his back to me. For a moment I thought he might turn around, that he might say something to reassure me, to tell me that everything was fine, that he'd be back in the morning like always. But he didn't. Instead, he stepped out into the night, the door clicking shut behind him. And just like that, he was gone. I ran to the door, flinging it open, but all I saw was the empty street bathed in the dim orange glow of the streetlights. There was no sign of him, no sound of his footsteps fading into the distance. Nothing. It was like he had vanished into thin air. I waited for him. I waited all night, sitting on the porch with a blanket wrapped around me, staring down the road, waiting for him to come back. But he never did. By morning, my mother was frantic, calling the police, calling everyone we knew, asking if anyone had seen him. No one had. It was like he had walked off the face of the earth. The days turned into weeks and the weeks into months. The police eventually stopped looking. They said there was no evidence of foul play, that he had simply left. People do that sometimes, they said. They just leave. But I knew better. I knew my father. He wouldn't just leave us. He wouldn't just walk out in the middle of the night without a word. Something had happened to him. Something terrible. But no one believed me. Not my mom, not the police, not anyone. They all thought he had run off, abandoned us. But I knew, deep down, I knew that wasn't the truth. And then the letters started coming. First, I thought they were a cruel joke. They arrived sporadically, no return address, just my name written on the front in shaky, uneven letters. Inside, There would be a single sheet of paper with a short, cryptic message written in the same shaky handwriting. "I didn't leave you." That was the first one. Just those 4 words. No explanation, no signature. Nothing. I showed it to my mom, but she brushed it off, saying it was probably some sick prank. But I knew better. I recognized the handwriting. It was my father's. The letters kept coming. Sometimes months would pass between them, but they always came, each one more unsettling than the last. "I'm not far. I'm trying to get back to you. Don't look for me." By the time the last one arrived, I was 17. My mom had remarried by then, moved on with her life, but I couldn't. I couldn't shake the feeling that something was terribly wrong, that my father was still out there, somewhere trying to reach me. The final letter was different from the others. It was longer, more desperate. The handwriting was shakier than ever, like whoever wrote it was barely able to hold the pen. "They're coming for you next." That was all it said. I didn't know what it meant. I still don't. But from that moment on, I couldn't shake the feeling that something was watching me, that something was lurking just beyond the edges of my perception, waiting. And then last week I saw him. I was walking home from work, the same small town where I had lived my whole life, when I saw him standing at the edge of the woods, just beyond the last streetlight. He looked exactly the same as he had the night he left. Same coat, same tired eyes, same haunted expression. But there was something wrong with him. His skin was pale, almost translucent, and his eyes, they were empty, like 2 black voids staring back at me. "Dad," I whispered, my voice barely audible over the sound of the wind rustling through the trees. He didn't say anything, just stood there, watching me, like he was waiting for something. And then, before I could say anything else, he turned and disappeared into the woods, swallowed by the darkness. I ran after him, calling his name, but when I reached the edge of the trees, he was gone. There was no sign of him, no trace that he had ever been there. But I know what I saw. I know it was him, and now I can't shake the feeling that whatever took him is coming for me next. I didn't sleep that night. How could I, after seeing him, my father, or at least something that looked like him? Standing at the edge of the woods, I felt the old fear crawling back into my chest. The same fear I'd felt when I was 9, sitting on the porch waiting for him to return. I thought I had buried it deep inside, but now it was bubbling to the surface, threatening to consume me. I couldn't shake the image of him, standing there with those hollow, black eyes. That wasn't the man I remembered. That wasn't my father. But if it wasn't him, then what was it? The next morning, I decided to return to the woods. I told myself it was to put my mind at ease, to prove to myself that what I saw had just been a trick of the light, a figment of my imagination. But deep down, I knew it was more than that. I knew I had to find answers. The woods behind my house had always been a place of mystery. As a kid, I had never ventured far into them. There were stories, old local legends about people disappearing there, about strange lights at night, but I had never paid much attention to them. Until now, as I made my way into the woods, the air grew colder, thicker, like it was pressing down on me. The trees seemed older here, their gnarled branches reaching out like skeletal fingers, blocking out most of the daylight. The deeper I went, the quieter it became. No birds, no rustling of leaves. Just the sound of my own breathing, quick and shallow. I followed the path where I had seen him, tracing my steps back to the edge of the woods. The place where he had stood seemed different in the daylight, less ominous, but the sense of dread remained. I stood there for a while, staring into the darkness of the forest, hoping, no dreading, that I would see him again. But there was nothing. After a few moments, I decided to venture deeper into the part of the woods I had never gone before. The trees grew denser, the path less distinct. I had the strange feeling that I was being watched, though every time I turned around, there was no one there. The further I went, the more disoriented I became. The trees seemed to shift around me, their twisted trunks forming a maze that I couldn't escape. And then I saw it. At first, I thought it was just a trick of the shadows, a dark shape moving between the trees, just on the edge of my vision. But it wasn't a trick. It was real. A figure, tall and gaunt, lurking in the shadows, watching me. My heart pounded in my chest as I squinted, trying to make out any details. But the figure remained indistinct, blending into the darkness. "Dad!" I called out, my voice trembling. The figure didn't respond. It just stood there, unmoving, like a statue carved from the shadows themselves. I took a step forward, then another, my feet moving almost involuntarily toward the figure. The closer I got, the more details I could make out. Its long, bony limbs, the ragged clothes that hung off its frame like they had been soaked in mud, the pale skin that seemed to glisten in the dim light. And then I saw its face. It wasn't my father. Its face was a twisted mockery of a human's, with deep, sunken eyes and a mouth that stretched too wide, revealing rows of sharp, blackened teeth. Its eyes locked onto mine, and I froze, every instinct in my body screaming at me to run. But I couldn't move. I was rooted to the spot, staring into those dead, hollow eyes. Without warning, the creature let out a low, guttural growl, a sound that seemed to vibrate in the very air around me. And then it moved, faster than anything I had ever seen. One moment it was standing still, the next it was rushing toward me, its long arms outstretched, fingers curled like claws. I stumbled backward, tripping over my own feet, and fell hard onto the ground. The creature was nearly on me, its mouth open wide, ready to strike. But then something stopped it. Just as it was about to reach me, it froze, its eyes widening in what I could only describe as fear. And then, as quickly as it had appeared, it backed away, retreating into the shadows, disappearing between the trees like it had never been there. I lay there on the ground, gasping for breath, my heart pounding in my ears. My mind was racing, trying to make sense of what had just happened. What the hell was that thing? And why had it stopped? After a few moments, I forced myself to my feet, my legs trembling beneath me. I needed to get out of there. I needed to leave before that thing decided to come back. But as I turned to go, I saw something on the ground where the creature had stood. At first, I thought it was just a rock, but as I got closer, I realized it was something else. It was a small, crumpled piece of paper. I hesitated for a moment before reaching down to pick it up, my fingers shaking as I unfolded it. The handwriting was the same as before, the same uneven, shaky letters that I had seen on the letters my father had sent me. "They're watching. Don't go any deeper." My heart skipped a beat. I looked around, half expecting to see the creature standing there again, but the woods were empty, silent. But the feeling of being watched was stronger now, almost suffocating. I shoved the note into my pocket and turned, running as fast as I could back the way I had come. The trees seemed to close in around me, the path twisting and turning, but I didn't stop, couldn't stop. I had to get out. I had to get away. When I finally burst out of the woods and onto the street, I collapsed onto the sidewalk, gasping for air. My head was spinning, my chest tight. I glanced back at the woods, half expecting to see that figure again, lurking at the edge of the trees. But there was nothing. I stood there for a while, catching my breath, trying to calm the pounding in my chest. I knew one thing for sure. Something was in those woods. Something dangerous. And whatever it was, it didn't want me there. As I made my way home, I couldn't stop thinking about the note. They were watching, but who were they? And why had my father warned me not to go any deeper? I had more questions than ever, but one thing was clear. My father hadn't just left. He had been taken, and whatever had taken him was still out there, watching, waiting, and now I was a part of it. The next few days felt like a blur. I couldn't focus on anything. Work, friends, even the simplest tasks became impossible. All I could think about was the note, the creature, and the terrifying possibility that my father hadn't left willingly all those years ago. The woods had taken him, and now they were coming for me. I tried to push the thoughts away, to convince myself that maybe it was all just a nightmare, some kind of stress-induced hallucination. But the note in my pocket was a tangible reminder that what I had seen wasn't just a dream. It was real, and the danger was closer than I ever imagined. The feeling of being watched didn't leave me either. No matter where I went, work, home, even the grocery store, it was there, creeping along the edges of my mind like a shadow I couldn't escape. I started keeping my curtains closed, locking all the doors and windows, but it didn't help. The sensation only grew stronger, more oppressive, until I could barely breathe under its weight. And then one night I heard the whispers. It was late, sometime after midnight, and I had been lying in bed, staring at the ceiling, when I first noticed them. Faint, barely audible at first, like the distant murmur of a conversation you weren't supposed to overhear. I sat up, straining to listen. The whispers were coming from outside, just beyond the window. I crept to the window, heart pounding, and pulled back the curtain just enough to peek outside. The street was empty, bathed in the soft glow of the streetlights, and the woods beyond the houses stood dark and silent. But the whispers didn't stop. They grew louder, more insistent, like a chorus of voices all speaking at once, overlapping, merging together into a sound that was both familiar and alien. I pressed my ear against the glass, trying to make out the words, but they were too garbled, too distorted to understand. Then, suddenly, the whispers stopped, and in their place came a single, clear voice. "Come back." I stumbled backward, nearly tripping over the edge of my bed. The voice, it had sounded just like my father's. I stood there, frozen, my heart hammering in my chest, waiting for the voice to return. But the night had gone silent again, as if nothing had happened. I didn't sleep at all after that. The next day, I decided I needed answers. I couldn't keep living in this constant state of fear, wondering what was lurking in the woods, what had taken my father. I had to find out the truth, no matter what it cost. There was only one place I could think of to start: my father's old workshop. After he disappeared, my mother had boxed up most of his things, but the workshop had been left untouched, like a shrine to the man we had lost. I hadn't set foot in there since I was a kid, but I knew if there were any clues about what had happened to him, they would be there. The workshop was out behind the house, a small, cluttered building that smelled of oil and wood dust. I pushed open the door, the rusty hinges creaking loudly, and stepped inside. The place looked exactly as I remembered. Tools scattered across the workbench, old car parts stacked in the corner, and my father's jacket still hanging on the hook by the door, covered in a fine layer of dust. I started rifling through the boxes, looking for anything that might give me a clue. A journal, a letter, anything that could explain why he had disappeared. But all I found were old car manuals, greasy rags, and a few broken tools. And then I found it. Tucked away in the bottom drawer of his workbench was a small, leather-bound notebook. It looked worn, the edges frayed, the leather cracking in places. I opened it cautiously, my fingers trembling, and started flipping through the pages. Most of the entries were mundane. Notes about car repairs, lists of parts he needed to order, but as I neared the back of the notebook, the tone changed. The handwriting became more erratic, the sentences shorter, more frantic. The first entry that caught my attention was dated a few weeks before he disappeared. Something's out there. I see it at the edge of the woods every night, watching me. It looks like a man, but it's not. I don't know what it is, but I can't let it get close. Not again. I felt a chill run down my spine. He had seen it too. The creature. He had known something was out there, watching him, just like it had been watching me. I kept reading, my heart racing as I flipped through the final pages of the notebook. The whispers started last night. They sound like my father's voice, but I know it's not him. It's something else. It's trying to lure me into the woods. But I won't go. I won't let it take me. I'm leaving tonight. I have to. It's getting too close. I don't want to leave them, but if I stay, it'll come for all of us. I can't let that happen. I'll go into the woods and I won't come back. It's the only way. That was the last entry. I sat there, staring at the notebook, my mind racing. My father hadn't run away. He had gone into the woods willingly, trying to protect us from whatever was out there. But it had taken him anyway, and now it was coming for me. That night, the whispers returned. Louder this time, more insistent. I sat by the window, gripping the notebook in my hands, my heart pounding in my chest as the voices grew closer, circling the house like a predator stalking its prey. I knew what I had to do. The next morning, I packed a bag with the essentials: flashlight, water, a knife, and my father's notebook, and headed for the woods. I wasn't running this time. I wasn't hiding. I was going to find the thing that had taken my father, and I was going to face it. As I stepped into the woods, the familiar sense of dread washed over me. But this time, I didn't turn back. I pushed forward, deeper into the forest, my father's warnings echoing in my mind. They're watching. Don't go any deeper. But I had to. I had to know what had taken him, what was lurking in the shadows of the woods, waiting for me. The deeper I went, the more the trees seemed to close in around me, their twisted branches forming a canopy that blocked out the sun. The whispers started again, faint at first, but growing louder with each step I took. And then I saw the figure. It was standing at the same spot I had seen it before, just beyond the edge of the trees, watching me with those hollow, black eyes. But this time I didn't run. I didn't freeze. I stepped forward, my hand gripping the knife at my side, my heart racing in my chest. "Where is my father?" I shouted, my voice trembling but strong. The figure didn't move, didn't speak, but the whispers grew louder, swirling around me like a storm. And then, slowly, it raised one long, bony finger and pointed deeper into the woods. I followed its gaze, my eyes narrowing as I peered into the darkness. And there, just beyond the last line of trees, I saw it. A door standing alone in the middle of the woods, its wooden frame warped and twisted, like something not meant to exist in this world. I knew in that moment that this was where my father had gone. This was where it had taken him. And this was where I was going to find him. I stood there, staring at the door. It was wrong, everything about it felt unnatural. It wasn't just the way it stood alone in the middle of the forest, with no walls or structure to support it. It was the way the woods seemed to pulse, like it was alive, breathing in time with the whispers that now surrounded me. The whispers had grown deafening, overlapping voices that all seemed to be calling my name. I knew without a doubt that my father had walked through this door, and I knew that if I wanted to find him, if I wanted answers, I had to go through too. My hand trembled as I reached for the handle. It was cold, almost freezing to the touch, sending a shiver up my arm. I hesitated for a moment, wondering if I was making a terrible mistake. But there was no turning back now. I had come too far, and whatever waited on the other side, I had to face it. With a deep breath, I turned the handle and pushed the door open. The moment I stepped through, everything changed. The world around me dissolved into darkness, an endless void, like stepping into the night itself. I couldn't see anything, couldn't hear anything except my own breathing, which echoed unnaturally in the space around me. I called out, my voice trembling, "Dad!" No response, just silence. I took a few tentative steps forward, my heart pounding in my chest, and then, out of the darkness, I saw him, my father. He was standing there, just a few feet away, bathed in a pale, eerie light. He looked the same as he had the night he disappeared, worn, tired, but alive. My heart leapt with hope as I rushed toward him. "Dad!" I cried, reaching out to him. But as I got closer, I realized something was wrong. His eyes were hollow, dark voids that seemed to suck in the light around him. His skin was pale, almost translucent, and his expression was empty, blank. He didn't move, didn't acknowledge me, just stood there, staring past me. "Dad!" I whispered, slowing to a stop. "It's me. I'm here to bring you home." He finally moved, but it wasn't to embrace me. Instead, his mouth twisted into a grotesque smile, unnaturally wide, his lips cracking as they stretched across his face. And then, in a voice that didn't belong to him, he spoke. "You shouldn't have come." The whispers surged again, louder than ever, filling my head with a cacophony of voices. My father's figure flickered, like a weak signal on a dying television, his image distorting and twisting. And then, the truth hit me like a punch to the gut. This wasn't my father. It was something else, something wearing his form, something that had been luring me here from the moment he disappeared. I stumbled back, my breath coming in ragged gasps as the figure stepped closer, its smile widening into something inhuman, its skin beginning to peel away, revealing the darkness underneath. "You were always meant to come," it hissed, its voice no longer even resembling my father's. "He was the first. But you..." It paused, its eyes locking onto mine. "You belong here now." I backed away, trying to keep the creature at a distance, but the void seemed to close in around me. There was nowhere to go, no way out. The door had disappeared behind me, swallowed by the darkness. Desperation clawed at me as I fumbled for the knife I had brought. It felt small, useless in my hand, but it was all I had. I held it out in front of me, my hands shaking as the creature continued to advance, its voice a low, guttural growl. "You can't escape," it said, and for a moment, its face flickered back to my father's, pleading, almost pitiful. "Neither could he," I screamed, lunging at the figure with the knife. But as soon as the blade connected with its flesh, the creature dissolved into smoke, disappearing into the shadows around me. The whispers grew louder, more frenzied, as if they were angry, as if they had been cheated. And then the void itself seemed to shift. The ground beneath me buckled, and suddenly I was falling through endless darkness, the whispers chasing me down into the abyss. I hit the ground hard, the impact knocking the wind from my lungs. When I opened my eyes, I realized I was no longer in the void. I was lying in the middle of the woods, the trees towering over me, their branches swaying gently in the wind. I scrambled to my feet, gasping for breath, disoriented. The door was gone. The creature was gone. Everything was silent. For a moment, I wondered if it had all been a dream, some twisted hallucination. But when I looked down at my hands, I saw the knife, stained with something dark and viscous. I had been there, and I had survived. But my father... I turned toward the woods, my heart aching with the weight of what I had seen, of what I now understood. My father had gone into the door all those years ago, just like I had. But he hadn't come back, and he never would. Whatever had taken him, whatever had lured him into the woods, had won. He was gone, lost to the darkness, to whatever world lay beyond that cursed door. And I knew, deep down, that if I had stayed any longer, I would have been lost too. As I made my way back through the woods, back to the life I had left behind, I felt a strange sense of finality settle over me. The door was gone, and so was the thing that had worn my father's face. But I would never forget what had happened in those woods. The whispers had stopped, but their memory would haunt me forever. Some things are better left unfound. Some doors should never be opened.